Hidden deep within the Appalachian Mountains, where mist lingers low over the valleys and dirt roads vanish into endless forests, there once lived a family whose secret baffled the world. The mountains of eastern Kentucky even today carry an air of mystery. Isolated hollers where neighbors were miles apart, and where life moved to its own rhythm, untouched by the outside world. It was here, along a rugged stretch of troublesome creek in the early 1800s, that a French immigrant named Martin Fugate built a simple life. He married into the community, raised his children, and worked the land like countless others, trying to survive in the harsh landscape of Appalachia. But the Fugates were not like the other families of Kentucky. Their children began to show something no one could ignore. Their skin was not the pale white of the settlers, nor the sun-darkened brown of farmers working long days in the fields. No, their skin carried a haunting shade of blue, a color so deep and unnatural that it set them apart instantly. Imagine, in an isolated village, a newborn child wrapped in blankets, only for the midwife to gasp, realizing the baby's face was not pink, but blue as a twilight sky. Word spread, whispers carried over mountains and rivers, a cursed family marked by some old sin, the Blue people of Kentucky. Some neighbors avoided them in fear, others mocked them in hushed voices, but most simply stared. And the Fugates, surrounded by suspicion, withdrew further into the mountains, living in silence with their strange secret. What could cause such a shocking condition? Was it a punishment, a quirk of fate, or something buried deep in the bloodline? For generations, no one had an answer. But the truth, when it finally came, was stranger than folklore. A rare genetic condition, amplified by generations of isolation and inbreeding, had turned the Fugates into living legends, the Blue people of Troublesome Creek. This is their story, a haunting mix of isolation, genetics, and the human struggle to survive stigma in one of America's most forgotten corners. In the year 1822, a man named Martin Fugate made a decision that would shape not only his family, but an entire Appalachian legend. He was a French immigrant, a quiet man by most accounts, who sought land, work, and a chance at stability in the rugged hills of eastern Kentucky. Like so many who traveled west in the early 19th century, Martin was drawn by promise. Cheap land, open country, and the possibility of carving out a life away from crowded cities and political turmoil. He found his new home along a stream called Troublesome Creek, a fitting name for a place as isolated as it was beautiful. Here, the mountains rose like fortress walls, cloaked in thick forests and mist that seemed to never leave the valleys. Neighbors were few and far between, roads were little more than muddy tracks, and travel beyond one's community often took days. This was the backdrop against which the Fugate family story began. Life in early 19th century Appalachia was not easy. Most families lived in poverty, farming just enough to feed themselves. Corn, beans, and root vegetables made up their diet, while hunting provided meat when luck allowed. The winters were harsh, with bitter cold sweeping through log cabins that barely held heat. Summers brought endless labor in the fields and fear of sickness that no doctor could properly treat. Religion played a central role in community life. Families would gather in rough-hewn wooden churches, often walking miles over rocky paths to attend a Sunday service. Faith gave people comfort against the challenges of hunger, disease, and isolation, yet superstition thrived here as well. Strange births, unusual illnesses, or appearances were often seen not as medical mysteries but as signs of curses, punishment, or God's will. This was a land where stories and whispers traveled faster than facts. What set Troublesome Creek apart was its geographical isolation. The mountains acted like natural barriers, making it difficult for outsiders to come in and equally hard for families to leave. Generations often lived and died within the same holler, marrying within their own kin or among the few neighboring families who shared their hardships. It was here that Martin Fugate married Elizabeth Smith, a woman of Irish descent whose family had also settled along the creek. Together they began raising children, planting roots in a place already defined by its seclusion. But that seclusion carried unseen consequences. With so few families in the region, marriage choices were limited. Cousins often married cousins, and family trees looped back on themselves. At the time, no one thought much of it. Survival mattered more than bloodlines, but with each generation, the genetic pool grew smaller, and hidden traits buried deep in their DNA had a greater chance of reappearing. Among Martin and Elizabeth's children, locals began to notice something strange. Some of the babies were born with a bluish tint to their skin. At first, midwives chalked it up to poor circulation, something that might fade with age. But it didn't fade. Instead, the children grew up with skin that ranged from pale lavender to deep indigo, depending on the day, the cold, or their exertion. Imagine the reaction in such a deeply religious, superstitious community. Neighbors whispered about curses, about sins in the bloodline, about God's judgment. Some called them Hansa, southern word for ghosts, believing the family was touched by something unnatural. The Fugates, already isolated, now carried the weight of a mystery that set them apart even further. Being a different in Appalachia was not easy. The Fugates already lived in poverty like everyone else, but the added stigma of their blue skin pushed them further into the margins of society. They rarely traveled far from Troublesome Creek. They worked their land quietly, lived off what they grew, and interacted as little as possible with outsiders. For the Fugate children, school was a struggle. Other children stared, whispered, sometimes mocked them. Some teachers considered them a distraction. The family learned to endure the stares and the rumors, keeping mostly to themselves. Over time, they became known simply as the Blue people. Because the region was so isolated, the Fugates often married within a very small circle of families. Smiths, Combs, Stacys, and Fugates intermarried generation after generation. Cousins married cousins, sometimes knowingly, sometimes without realizing how closely related they truly were. This pattern wasn't unusual in Appalachia at the time. In remote valleys, choices were limited, and the idea of traveling long distances to find a spouse was nearly impossible. But for the Fugates, the genetic consequences were profound. Each union increased the likelihood of passing along a rare trait buried in Martin Fugate's genes, a condition that altered the way blood carried oxygen through the body. The result was the striking blue tint that marked their skin for generations. Despite the whispers, the Fugates carried on with life much like their neighbors. They farmed, fished, raised animals, and clung to survival. The mountains demanded resilience. Men worked long hours in fields and forests, women carried the burdens of childbirth and endless household labor, and children learned early how to help their families. Illnesses like typhoid, cholera, and influenza swept through communities unchecked, often wiping out entire households. Doctors were rare, and when they did appear, their treatments were primitive at best, dangerous at worst. Most families relied on home remedies, herbs, poultices, prayers, and folklore cures. For the Fugates, who faced not only common sicknesses but also their strange blue skin, medical help was almost non-existent. Faith was both a comfort and a curse. Some preachers saw the Fugates as a warning, an example of what happens when families live in isolation and defy the natural order. Others quietly avoided the subject, unwilling to stir fear in their congregations. But among neighbors, the whispers persisted. Stories spread of blue children born under the light of a cursed moon, of families who hid their babies from view, ashamed of their color, of strange powers or ailments carried in their blood. These stories were rarely challenged because few outsiders ventured into the hollers to investigate. For nearly a century, the Fugates remained a curiosity, part folklore, part reality, whispered about in neighboring towns but seldom understood. What is most remarkable about the Fugates is not just their condition, but their endurance. They survived hunger, disease, isolation, and ridicule. They continued raising children, tending land, and building lives in a region that already tested every ounce of human strength. Though their skin set them apart in every other way, they were simply Appalachian farmers, hard-working, faithful, and resilient. And yet, their legacy would outlast all others. For in their bloodline lay a mystery that science would not begin to unravel until more than 100 years later. By the dawn of the 20th century, the Fugates had become legend in eastern Kentucky. Stories of the Blue people of Troublesome Creek have fascinated outsiders who rarely, if ever, encountered them in person. But eventually, doctors and researchers would come looking, determined to uncover the truth behind the family's strange blue skin. And what they found was not a curse, nor a superstition, but a rare genetic condition. A quirk of chemistry that turned an isolated family into one of America's most haunting medical mysteries. It began quietly, in the dim light of a log cabin along Troublesome Creek. When Martin Fugate's wife gave birth to their first children in the 1820s, the midwives and neighbors who came to help were struck with disbelief. The babies were healthy, crying, kicking, and breathing strong, but their skin carried a strange bluish cast as if shadows were clinging to their bodies. At first, some thought it was poor circulation, a condition that would fade with time. But days passed, then weeks, and the color did not leave. The Fugate children remained unmistakably blue. For the family, it was both a mystery and a quiet dread. Martin and his wife had no answers. no understanding of how or why their children looked different. In those mountains, science had little reach, and there were no doctors nearby who could explain such a thing. All they knew was that their children were alive and strong, though marked by something no one could name. Neighbors, however, reacted with unease. In a small, tightly knit community, difference was rarely tolerated. Whispers began almost immediately that the Fugates had been cursed for their isolation, that their blood carried some hidden sin. Some avoided visiting the cabin altogether, fearing that what afflicted the children might spread. For the Fugates, the birth of their blue-skinned children was not just the start of a family, but the beginning of a legend that would follow them for generations. It did not take long for whispers to grow into story. In the hollows of Kentucky, where every life was touched by religion, poverty, and old mountain lore, the sight of blue-skinned children was too strange to explain. Neighbors leaned on what they knew: superstition. Some claimed the Fugates had been cursed by God, punished for marrying within their own bloodline and settling in a place so cut off from the rest of the world. To them, the blue skin was not an accident of nature, but a divine mark of shame. Others reached for darker tales. The Appalachian hills were full of stories of witchcraft, ghosts, and signs from the devil. A few swore that the Fugates had made a pact with something unholy, and the blue skin was proof of their corruption. Around church fires and in Sunday sermons, their name became an example, whispered warnings of what happened when families strayed from God's law. Among the younger folk, the gossip twisted even further. Some believed the Fugates were not fully human at all, but mountain spirits or a Heinzel disguised as people. Children dared each other to wander near the Fugates' homestead, whispering that if one looked too long into their eyes, the curse would spread like a sickness. The story spread beyond Troublesome Creek, carried by travelers and preachers, until the Fugates became less of a family and more of a myth. What began as simple gossip hardened into a legend, one that painted them as cursed, dangerous, and forever apart from their neighbors. For the Fugates themselves, it was a wound deeper than poverty, forcing them to turn further inward, bound together by both blood and the weight of suspicion. As the years passed, the Fugates found themselves drawing further away from the outside world. The gossip had not faded. It had only hardened. Every trip into town brought stares, whispered words, and the quiet cruelty of being treated as different. Children pointed at them in the market. Adults muttered prayers under their breath, and preachers used their family name as a warning against sin and pride. For a family already struggling with poverty, this constant judgment was unbearable. The Fugates decided that if the world saw them as cursed, then they would live apart from it. Instead of traveling often to the small towns nearby, they built their lives deeper in the Appalachian Mountains, where the land was unforgiving, but the silence at least brought peace. Cut off from neighbors, the family relied only on themselves. They raised what livestock they could, farmed the rocky soil, and learned to survive without the comfort of community. Over time, their world grew smaller, bound not by fences but by mountains. With so few outsiders entering their valley, the Fugates intermarried within their extended kin, sealing their isolation. This withdrawal was not just physical, it was emotional too. The Fugates became wary of strangers, protective of their own, and resigned to a fate they neither chose nor fully understood. Their blue skin had pushed them away from society, and in the quiet of the mountains, that difference only deepened with every generation. Life in the Appalachian Hills during the 1800s was already harsh for most families, and for the Fugates it was even more unforgiving. The land was rugged, the soil thin and rocky. Farming demanded backbreaking labor, and even then, harvests were often meager. Corn and beans became staples, while hunting in the dense woods filled whatever gaps their crops left. Every winter brought the threat of hunger, and every summer required endless toil just to survive. Poverty shaped every corner of their lives. Clothes were patched and repatched until fabric could no longer hold a stitch. Children grew up barefoot more often than not, running over sharp stones and icy ground because shoes were too valuable to waste. Medical help was nearly non-existent in such isolated valleys, and illness was treated with old remedies, prayers, and endurance. Religion, however, thrived. Small wooden churches echoed with fiery sermons about sin, judgment, and salvation. For the Fugates, these gatherings were double-edged. Faith gave them hope, but the stares and whispers from neighbors reminded them they were outsiders even in the house of God. Their blue skin turned them into examples, living warnings used by preachers to frighten congregations into obedience. In this world of poverty, faith, and fear, the Fugates learned to endure quietly. They worked the land, kept to themselves, and lived under the weight of both survival and suspicion. Appalachia was their home, but it was also their prison. One made not of walls, but of mountains and the harsh judgment of others. By the late 1800s, the Fugates were no longer just a family. They had become a story. Travelers passing through the Kentucky mountains carried tales of the Blue people, stories that grew wilder with every retelling. Some swore the Fugates only appeared at night, moving like shadows through the woods. Others claimed they were half-spirit, not truly human at all, cursed to wander the hills as a warning to others. In nearby towns, their name was spoken like a ghost story, a mix of fascination and fear. But the reality of the Fugates' lives was far different. Behind the myths, they were ordinary mountain folk, men who swung axes from dawn until dusk, women who tended gardens and soothed babies, children who played in creeks and fields just like any others. Their blue skin did not make them supernatural, only different. They felt hunger, love, sorrow, and faith no less deeply than the neighbors who whispered against them. Still, the legends had power. Each exaggerated tale pushed them further from acceptance, painting them as curiosities rather than people. For the Fugate, myth became a second prison layered over the first. They endured, carving out their lives quietly in the shadows of Appalachia, never knowing that one day science, not superstition, would finally explain their strange, inherited color. By the dawn of the 20th century, Appalachia was no longer as isolated as it once had been. Railroads cut through the valleys, roads connected once hidden towns, and doctors from the outside world began traveling into the mountains. With them came curiosity, and soon the whispered stories of the Blue people of Kentucky reached medical ears. Newspapers occasionally printed short, sensational accounts of a family whose skin was tinted indigo, their condition unexplained. Outsiders who ventured near Troublesome Creek often returned with tales that blurred fact and folklore, feeding the growing fascination. To locals, the Fugate and part mystery. But to doctors, this sounded like an unsolved medical riddle, a chance to uncover a hidden truth. One name rose above all others in this pursuit, Dr. Madison Caween, a young hematologist from the University of Kentucky. Unlike the mountain folk who viewed the Fugates through the lens of superstition, Caween saw a scientific puzzle. He traveled into the remote hollows of Perry County in the 1960s, determined to meet the family and understand what made them different. Dr. Caween's arrival was not greeted with easy smiles. The Fugates had learned to distrust outsiders, especially those who came with too many questions. But Caween's persistence, coupled with his willingness to trek through rugged terrain to reach their cabins, slowly earned him access. One by one, he examined members of the family. What struck him was not just their blue skin, but their otherwise normal health. They worked, laughed, and lived just as any other mountain family did. There were no signs of illness, no mysterious weakness. The only difference was their extraordinary color. Among them was Luna Fugate, remembered vividly in town lore. Locals described her as being as blue as Lake Louise, her skin a deep, striking shade that startled strangers at first sight. Yet Luna lived a full life, married, raised children, and carried herself with quiet dignity despite the stares. To Caween, she was living proof that whatever condition this was, it did not rob the Fugates of vitality. For the first time, the family story shifted from rumor to research. Caween began testing blood samples, determined to trace the cause of their unusual hue. Through long nights of study, Dr. Caween uncovered the key. The Fugates' blueness was caused by a rare hereditary condition called methemoglobinemia. In simple terms, their blood carried too much methemoglobin, a form of hemoglobin that cannot release oxygen effectively. While normal blood is bright red when oxygenated, high levels of methemoglobin cause blood to appear dark, almost chocolate brown. Through the skin, this gave the family their remarkable blue tint. The condition itself was genetic, passed down through generations of intermarriage in the isolated hollows of Appalachia. In most places, the gene would have disappeared into a larger population, but in Troublesome Creek, where cousins often married cousins out of necessity, the gene flourished. For the Fugates, this discovery was both revelation and relief. Their blueness was not a curse, not witchcraft, and not evidence of sin. It was science, pure and simple. Caween also discovered a solution. He began administering methylene blue, a treatment that temporarily restored normal skin color. When injected or taken orally, it converted the excess methemoglobin back into functional hemoglobin, allowing the blood to carry oxygen properly. To the amazement of the Fugates and their neighbors, blue skin turned pink within minutes. For a family long defined by their difference, it was a small miracle. The treatment brought more than medical relief. It brought a kind of social freedom. Some Fugates who had lived their whole lives under stares and whispers now saw themselves reflected in the mirror with the same pink tones as their neighbors. For them, methylene blue was not just a drug. It was a doorway into normalcy. Yet others, like Luna Fugate, had lived so long with their blue skin that they wore it almost like a badge of identity. Luna reportedly accepted herself as she was, never seeking to change what nature had given her. She raised her children and worked her farm without shame, reminding outsiders that while science could explain the condition, it could not erase the decades of pride and endurance built into their lives. Kaween's research gained attention, and soon the story of the Fugates was known across America. Articles appeared in medical journals and popular magazines alike. The once isolated family became a case study, their condition serving as both scientific curiosity and human story. By the late 20th century, the isolation that had once trapped the Fugates began to fade. Roads improved, outsiders moved into the region, and marriages outside the family line slowly diluted the gene. Cases of methemoglobinemia became fewer with each passing generation. But the legend of the blue people never disappeared. To scientists, they remain a remarkable example of how genetics and geography can shape human history. To locals, they remain part of Appalachian lore, a story told with equal parts pride and unease. The arrival of doctors like Madison Kaween had finally peeled back the layers of myth, proving that the Fugates' color was no curse, no ghostly omen, but the product of biology. And yet, in the quiet hollows of Kentucky, their story still lingers, suspended between folklore and fact. In the Appalachian Mountains, stories were as common as the wind. Families gathered on porches around wood stoves or in the glow of kerosene lamps, passing tales from one generation to the next. Among the most whispered, especially in Kentucky, was that of the blue people. Long before doctors arrived, the Fugates of Troublesome Creek were not seen as patients, but as omens. Neighbors spoke in hushed voices about strange children born with skin the color of shadows, their hue deepening in the winter cold until they looked like spirits walking among men. These whispers spread across counties, twisting as they went. Some said the Fugates had been marked by God for their sins. Others claimed they were witches, their color proof of unholy power. A few even swore they were mountain haints, ghosts masquerading as flesh and blood. For isolated mountain folk who leaned heavily on religion and superstition, such stories filled the gaps where knowledge ended. The Fugates became both real people and ghostly warnings, their lives folded into the fabric of Appalachian folklore. Folklore has a way of transforming truth into myth. By the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the story of the blue people was no longer confined to Troublesome Creek. Travelers, preachers, and traders carried the tale beyond Perry County, often adding their own flourishes. In one version, the Fugates were said to glow in the moonlight, their blue skin shining like a lantern in the woods. In another, they were cursed wanderers, forever trapped in the hills, doomed to never leave Kentucky. Each retelling added distance between reality and imagination. The Fugates were no longer simple farmers, but figures of mystery, creatures who belonged more to ghost stories than to census records. The irony was that these myths often overshadowed the Fugates' real struggles. Their poverty, their isolation, their hard work on stubborn mountain soil, all of it was erased beneath the weight of rumor. To outsiders, they were curiosities. To locals, they were cautionary tales. And to themselves, they were simply trying to live. Religion played a central role in deepening the myths. In mountain churches, where fiery sermons warned of hellfire and sin, preachers pointed to the Fugates as living examples of God's judgment. Their skin was said to be a divine punishment, proof of what happened when families married too close or when communities turned away from righteousness. This moral framing gave power to the legend. Parents used the story to frighten their children into obedience. Stay away from the creek at night, or the blue people will take you. Gossip turned them into symbols of both fear and fascination. Yet, beneath these tales was a kernel of truth. The Fugates were indeed isolated, their marriages often kept within kin. Their skin was indeed blue, the result of a rare genetic condition. But the leap from fact to folklore was vast. In a world where science was scarce and superstition was plentiful, the line blurred until the Fugates themselves became something larger than life. The arrival of doctors in the 20th century shattered much of the myth. With tests, research, and treatment, the Fugates' condition was revealed not as a curse but as methemoglobinemia, a genetic quirk of blood chemistry. Methylene blue injections could even reverse the color temporarily, turning the legendary blue people into ordinary pink-skinned neighbors within minutes. Yet folklore does not vanish easily. Even after the scientific explanation spread, the legend endured. People preferred the mystery of curses and ghost stories over the neat precision of medical terms. The truth may have freed the Fugates from superstition, but it could not erase decades of gossip, carved into the culture of Appalachia. In fact, the clash between folklore and science only deepened fascination. Articles in national magazines portrayed the Fugates as both medical marvel and mountain myth, cementing their place in American lore. The family existed in two worlds, the real and the imagined. The tale of the Fugates shows how truth and rumor can entwine until they are nearly inseparable. The reality was simple: a family with a rare genetic disorder, surviving as best they could in the rugged isolation of Appalachia. But the folklore was richer, darker, and more lasting. Blue-skinned spirits cursed by God, living proof of mountain sin. Even today, when science has long since explained their condition, the legend lingers. In Kentucky, the phrase "a blue people" still stirs memories of whispers passed down through generations. Online, the Fugates are retold as both medical anomaly and ghost story. In the end, their story is not just about genetics. It is about the human need to explain the unexplainable. When faced with mystery, communities turn to folklore, and sometimes those stories grow so strong that even the truth can only live alongside them, never fully replacing the legend. The story of the Fugates of Troublesome Creek had, for more than a century, carried the weight of whispers. Neighbors spoke of a family touched by God's wrath, of a people whose blood carried some unholy stain. Their skin, tinted in shades of indigo and midnight, had become their legacy. For generations, they endured suspicion, ridicule, and forced isolation. Yet, what the world feared as supernatural was, in the end, a matter of science. By the mid-20th century, medicine had advanced far enough to probe mysteries once left to folklore. Enter Dr. Madison Coween II, a hematologist at the University of Kentucky in the 1960s. Where others saw an oddity to be avoided, Coween saw a puzzle to be solved. He traveled into the Appalachian hollows, carrying his instruments and curiosity, determined to discover why an entire family had turned blue. The Fugates themselves were hesitant. To them, outsiders often meant judgment or mockery. But Coween approached with empathy rather than ridicule. His examinations revealed a remarkable truth. Their blue skin was the visible mark of a rare genetic condition called methemoglobinemia. The family carried a recessive trait that, when inherited from both parents, caused an abnormality in hemoglobin, the very molecule responsible for carrying oxygen in the blood. Instead of oxygen-rich crimson, their blood held a dark, chocolate-brown shade. Their skin, in turn, appeared an otherworldly blue. Coween's discovery did not remain theoretical. He tested treatments on affected family members, most famously injecting methylene blue, a simple dye that acted almost like a chemical switch. Within minutes of the injection, the blue tint in the skin faded, replaced by a healthy pink glow. For the Fugates, the transformation was nothing short of miraculous. What seemed like divine punishment turned out to be a quirk of human biology, treatable, reversible, and free of curses. The case of Luna Fugate became legendary in medical circles. Luna, remembered as a kind but striking figure, was said to be as blue as Lake Louise, her skin almost glowing in its intensity. Yet she lived a full life, bore many children, and endured with quiet dignity the scrutiny of both neighbors and physicians. Her story was proof that behind the myth of deformity and supernatural affliction stood ordinary people, enduring extraordinary circumstances. The emotional weight of Coween's breakthrough extended beyond science. For the Fugates and for Appalachia at large, it was a release from generations of stigma. The community began to see them less as cursed figures and more as people marked by an unusual but explainable condition. In towns where church sermons once whispered of sin and retribution, the narrative began to shift. Science had provided an answer where superstition had long ruled, yet the revelation also underscored the tragedy of their isolation. For decades, treatment could have been possible had they lived in a less remote corner of America. Poverty and geographic isolation kept them hidden, locked in cycles of intermarriage that preserved the genetic condition. Their story was as much about the costs of seclusion as it was about biology. By the 1980s, the blue people of Kentucky were less a source of fear and more a subject of fascination, studied in medical journals and featured in documentaries. For scientists, the Fugates became a case study in how genetics and environment intertwine. For locals, they became part of the cultural tapestry of Appalachia, living proof of how easily myth can grow when science is absent. The climax of the Fugate's tale, then, was not a single revelation, but a shift in perception. What once appeared as a curse etched into the skin was unmasked as a treatable condition. Where there had been whispers of witchcraft, there were now words like enzyme deficiency and a recessive inheritance. The blue children of Troublesome Creek, feared for so long, were finally understood. And in that moment of uncovering, the story turned from eerie folklore into human resilience. The Fugates had not been chosen for punishment. They had been chosen for uniqueness. Their survival, despite poverty, alienation, and relentless rumor, became their truest legacy. The saga of the Fugates of Troublesome Creek lingers as more than just a medical curiosity. It is a reminder of how isolation can shape families, communities, and even the myths we pass down through generations. For the Fugates, their blue skin became both their identity and their burden. It set them apart in a world where difference was feared, whispered about, and condemned. Appalachia itself, the mountains, the valleys, the hidden hollows, played as much a role in this story as bloodlines did. Geography became destiny. The remoteness of Kentucky's hills trapped the Fugates in cycles of inbreeding, cut them off from medical knowledge, and amplified every rumor that passed from neighbor to neighbor. In such isolation, the line between truth and superstition blurred, giving birth to legends of curses and divine retribution. But behind the folklore lay something more human. The Fugate story reflects how stigma can wound as deeply as any illness. They endured ridicule, suspicion, and exclusion, when all along their condition carried no moral meaning, only a genetic quirk. In many ways, their survival, their persistence, and their dignity in the face of misunderstanding reveal a greater truth. People can carry heavy burdens and still endure with grace. The scientific revelation in the 20th century of methemoglobinemia and its treatment brought not only medical clarity, but also emotional closure. It was as if a century of fear had finally lifted, replaced by compassion and understanding. The Fugate's transformation from a cursed family to a medical marvel stands as a lesson in how knowledge can dissolve stigma, how science can rewrite narratives once trapped in superstition. Yet even as the Fugate's tale resolves, one question lingers in the shadows of those Kentucky mountains. How many other families, hidden away in forgotten corners of America, have lived under the weight of mystery? How many other stories, half-truths, whispered rumors, unexplained conditions, have been buried by time and silence? The Fugates remind us that the truth often hides in the margins, waiting for someone to look closer, to ask the questions others are too afraid to ask. Their story is not only about blue skin, it is about what happens when isolation meets ignorance, when families are left to carry their burdens alone. And it is about what changes when empathy, science, and human curiosity finally arrive. So we close with this thought. In America's forgotten mountains, where poverty and pride meet silence and superstition, what other hidden stories lie waiting to be uncovered?